Ladies and gentlemen, I welcome you to our session we have here about will the future medicine be cost efficient and socio-economic? It's interesting how this conference develops, and for those who have been here for 7 years now, at the beginning it was a mixture of dreams and of visions, but it didn't had a lot of reality in it. Most of it was science and hard facts, where maybe only the results of the scientific research. Now we come to the next stage where we see the clear translation. In the previous session we had some interesting topics addressed about all the aspects which have to be respected if it comes into maturity, be it registration or regulatory points or also the public. We will have a reduced session here, as unfortunately I have to tell you that Dr. Robinson had to renounce on short notice and had to withdraw his attendance due to private reasons. So we have more time for discussions, and our speakers have more time to speak about their topics. I first welcome Michael Rossbach. He is Director of Business Development and Scientific Program Management in Genome Institute of Singapore. Singapore is, like nanomedicine, something which evolved in this field recently and with a lot of momentum in it. And so we are very happy to hear from him progress towards translation and economical challenges. And Michael, I hand you over and welcome and ask you to give your speech.
Yeah, thank you very much. That was number 2 already. Yeah, my name is Michael Rossbach. It's a great pleasure to be here today. I'm currently at the Genome Institute of Singapore, which is a center for human genomics and a kind of a factory for biomarker discovery. And I sit in a lot of meetings around biomarker discovery, coming out from human genetics, infectious diseases, and of course cancer. And I started to think about more and more over the last couple of years about the economic impact and the economic view on personalized medicine and also personalized healthcare. What does it mean to translate findings into clinical practice? Because in like many cases, starting from early biomarker discovery, we go only into clinical research. So this is kind of the opening statement. Personalized medicine promises to increase, of course, the quality of clinical care and in some cases decrease healthcare costs. And my hypothesis is actually that the biggest challenges and hurdles are actually economic and not scientific. If we look at clinical studies very broadly and from a high level view, we see that more than 50% of all clinical studies that actually include or in some cases somehow involve biomarkers are performed in oncology. And these data are not very surprising, as the research in oncology is still, in terms of the biomarker discovery side, relatively easy than in other cases. And of course, the better patient treatment through advanced diagnostics and personalized medicine aims to use biomarkers as a clinical decision-making tool, going from early discovery, let's say in a fusion transcript that you find in prostate cancer, to perform an early diagnostic test, and then use it to actually stratify your patients in different groups like responders, non-responders, or those who actually show severe adverse drug reactions or side effects, and then based on that, give these individual groups the best available treatment. Now, it seems like in many cases, we today give very good drugs to the wrong patients. If you look into the conventional medical approaches, like a lot of efficiency is stated here in this table, shows you that the drug actually doesn't work. So we need tools to stratify our patients and better stratify the patients to actually create better outcomes. And from a scientific view, this is not very surprising, but from the economics view, I'll later give a couple of examples where this is actually quite challenging. So why economics in personalized healthcare is actually paramount. The healthcare providers today need to know whether the approach of personalized medicine or this concept of personalized medicine is actually affordable. So going from price to value. And if you look at this graph, this is showing on the y-axis the annual R&D costs per NME, a new medical entity, like a new drug, in millions of dollars over the years, and you see a steep increase, so it gets much more expensive to actually develop novel drugs. So if we look at some of these market drivers and also the restraints of personalized medicine, I'd just like to highlight a couple of few here from this whole table. So you see the drivers up here and the restraints basically. So we kind of need more cost-efficient drugs. We need more collaboration between the different stakeholders in the industry. We need to become a drug discovery and the development processes more profitable. And of course, we need rather cures than actually lifelong or chronic treatment of a disease. In the restraint section, like policy, healthcare policies in different countries, so I'm not going into details, vary still a lot, so that makes it difficult for alignment in that space. We need to address regulatory aspects, of course. And there's still a lot of ethical implications and, of course, data safety if you think about genomics data or, in general, personal healthcare data, which nowadays are stored, for example, in cloud-based environments. So there's still some restraints and issues. If we look at the technology drivers and restraints, we see a couple of examples here, like we kind of need to align genomics data with proteomics data, with metabolomics data, and actually sync the genotypic findings on genomics discovery projects with the actually phenotypic ones, and really drives that into clinical practice. And the development of these genomic, proteomic biomarkers actually, of course, bears a lot of challenges, but has a very high potential to actually significantly advance healthcare and treatment. Ultimately, the idea is to do large-scale trials and use biomarkers to shrink down the patient trial size, get better outcomes and better data, and create, on the systems biology side or bioinformatics side, tools to actually predict outcome, like toxicity prediction or chemoresponse screens that you do in a kind of bioinformatic environment, like modeling. And the bioinformatics then will ultimately give better tools for R&D and virtual testing. Now, again, on the constraint side, just a few examples, like the need for very robust scientific evaluation and the relationship between a biomarker and also the clinical outcome. So far, I often have the feeling that the biomarker discovery community and the clinical community are not talking a lot to each other. So that is still in a kind of silo. So really to integrate these findings with clinical outcomes, so we can really say this particular biomarkers make an impact, and we can prove that, will be very critical for the success. So if we again look from the economics view on this value world, of course the heaven would be, from an economics view, low cost but very high benefit. In this case, for example, for a patient. If it's low cost and, if it's low benefit and very high cost, this is of course a no-go. The reality is somewhere up here, like we have a window of costs, we have a window of benefits, and particularly in the oncology space, this benefit window is still not very promising yet, and I'll show you in a minute why. Because if we look at targeted drugs in terms of which targets are we, do we have discovered and are we going after, what are the costs, what is the survival related with these targeted drugs, and what are potential severe side events, all this together gives us an idea about the value of certain drugs. So these are just a couple of targets. You might probably know most of them, EGFR, VEGF, and RAF, for example. If you look at the total costs, and if you look in the increase of overall survivals in years, these numbers are not extremely surprising and unfortunately not very, very good, whereas the cost side is very, very high. So basically what we can find is with these new targeted drugs that are linked to certain biomarkers is, if we look at oncology as a main example again, the cancer therapy is not very effective. So in the US alone, last year, approximately $100 billion were spent on cancer research and the discovery of novel therapeutics, for example, through fusion transcripts that you target very specifically, and then you come up with some immune therapy-based approaches. But what we saw this morning in some of the presentations was a map of Basel and the different roadblocks that you can actually put into a cell to actually inhibit a certain pathway. We saw emergence of detours and the pathways that are actually going around this roadblock, and you come up with resistance, etc. So it is a very dynamic system, and sadly to say, the drugs per se have very limited effect so far, and the 5-year survival is not much improving. And particularly in Singapore, we look at cancers that are mostly prevalent in Asia, like gastric, lung cancer, esophageal cancer, and this 5-year survival is surely not improving. The costs of healthcare and treatment shoot through the roof, and the discovery projects leading eventually to novel therapeutics are extremely expensive. So the success that we get, as you saw in this table here, is marginal. It's rather months than years, and still, if we talk about saving today a cancer patient, the bulk saving is still done with surgery. So let's have a look at the economic rationale then for the personal health care. Like, the promise is easy. It's, of course, always said we want to have increased efficiency of the personal therapies to offset prices of drugs. We have also, at the end of the day, increased safety of personalized therapies that will reduce the cost due to prevention of adverse reactions, side effects to the normal or conventional drugs, because we can now stratify patients, let's say, with a simple blood-based biomarker test. We can reduce high expenses because we save people from hospitalization. One example I can mention here is a big project that we do in Singapore around dengue, the so-called Stop Dengue project. Dengue is on the rise in Southeast Asia, and there's, as you might know, in the progression pathway, 2 types of patients that we see. Usually, if someone gets a positive dengue infection, it starts with a fever, it goes up for a few days, maybe 2-3 days, and the fever drops. And in many cases, the disease does not come back in a severe form. Whereas in other patients, there is another incubation time of like maybe 2-3 days, and then suddenly these patients show up with shock bleedings, which are extremely dangerous, of course, and fatal, can be fatal. So we wanted to know early on, if someone shows up with a dengue infection and the dengue test is positive, which patients do we have to hospitalize right away and which probably not. So we did some large-scale GWAS studies, genome-wide association studies, to look for that, and indeed found 2 gene loci that are kind of predictive for the severe dengue shock syndrome. So at the end of the day, we will be able to stratify patients, and we don't have to actually hospitalize everyone who shows up with dengue. And then, of course, the predictive diagnostics will help actually reduce costs ultimately through prevention. The factors including, in this case, or in this context, the payer adoption, coverage and reimbursement are one of the biggest hurdles that we see right now. So, of course, the strength of evidence is important, meaning that drives the payer's decision about coverage and also reimbursement. This varies a lot between countries, of course, and varies widely depending on which technology is actually applied. Professional society guidelines actually influence, of course, reimbursement schemes, and the regulation and the cost effectiveness are increasingly associated with the reimbursement itself. So again, the benefits, we want to, of course, have advanced screening for disease, ideally with a simple blood-based biomarker. We can avoid severe drug reactions, and again, an example in Singapore is that we currently build a nationwide adverse drug reaction network, so to speak, because there is still more than 1% of patients in Singapore that show up with so-called ADRs, adverse drug reactions, and some of them can be very fatal and lethal, of course. We want to have safer drugs and vaccines, and that is also part of the promise of personalized medicine. And we get more accurate methods of determining the drug actions itself and also the dosage. The increased patient satisfaction, quality of life is also, of course, always mentioned in this context. And also you always find lower costs, but this is really true. So we are really going from the predictive care towards more integrated care, professional, personalized care, meaning we integrate clinical data as a first step, and ultimately the idea is, of course, to go from treating patients to preventive medicines and preventive medical care through early detection of diseases, and kind of shift around the current scheme from more acute treatment to more preventive interactions. So can we ask return of investment questions in this context? If we now talk about everything will lower the cost, and the question, is that really true? Let's ask a couple of questions around the ROI. So does personalized medicine actually have a quantifiable ROI, return of investment? And if so, to whom are the benefits accrued, and under what time frame do we actually get a positive return of investment? And is there a possible economic framework that we can think of to demonstrate the differences in the ROI across the different stakeholders, and then later go through the different stakeholders one by one? And if so, can the differences elucidate the incentives and also the barriers that we have for these stakeholders to actually adopt or invest in personalized medicine? And if there are actually significant gaps that we see today between the value expected, if I, let's say, invest in personalized medical care, and between the different stakeholders, what can we do, or what strategies do we think of to actually close these gaps and bridge between the stakeholders and actually close the gap and come up with affordable, better personalized treatment? So to summarize this is like your name here. The net value of personalized medicine intervention could be like described. We, of course, get reduced adverse events like side effects or patients that are not susceptible to a certain treatment, reduced life costs, of course, reduced non-medical costs, minus, of course, the cost of the intervention itself. And there's a lot of non-economic benefits like the quality of life or the longer life of, let's say, a cancer patient. So this is always shown as a classic scenario. If you look at the consumers here in blue, the upper curve, which are in this case our patients, they always win in this classic scenario. Meaning, of course, we have improved efficiency, of course we get reimbursement or partially coverage from, let's say, government or health insurances funds, and the payers actually, so the consumers win, so to speak, the patients win, the payers achieve a positive return of investment in models where you say, okay, after a couple of years, we can kind of get to break even here and make profit out of this classic scenario. Life science companies like biotech and pharma actually might lose because basically the market will shrink in this scenario. But diagnostic companies will eventually get more revenues because we have more tests and more specific tests. And the key word that is always that you always hear in this context is going from blockbusters to niche busters, like a very specific test for a very specific patient group, but then you can actually justify potentially higher prices. So diagnostic companies developing such tests like genetically based or targeted tests may alter the current course of care, like we're getting reduced adverse reactions, we increase the accuracy in diagnosis, so the patients will definitely benefit. And firms that actually even decrease the R&D cost itself may still be able to get substantial returns because, as I mentioned, we have more targeted populations. Clinical trials might shrink in size, but you have the right patients or the right enrollees, so to speak. You can eventually do more virtual R&D, like more modeling, more testing, more informatics studies, and eventually get priority or shortcuts with the regulatory authorities, which definitely is a key advantage in the approval process. Employers, of course, may benefit from improved productivity of human capital, and the government and the public coverage plans may actually also benefit from this environment. So in terms of the stakeholder incentives and the challenges, like the scientific challenges are mostly in the molecular mechanisms. Generally, if we look at differentiation pathways in cells, if we look at drug response of cells to a certain drug, or the drug delivery to a specific cell, not much is understood yet. Of course, we have advances in many cases, but it is still, in many cases, impossible to actually narrow it down to one specific marker that you can use for a certain disease, or we just don't know which ligand receptor interaction occur. We think of orphan receptors in this case. But on the other hand, of course, constantly we get novel technologies, and if you think of genomics data, every half year or every 6 months, you get a new sequencing platform that is launched. It's getting cheaper to sequence whole human genome even, but then people struggle, of course, with the data analysis. In terms of the economic challenges, which I think are way more challenging than the scientific ones, is really the key, the poor alignment of the individual stakeholders and the poorly aligned incentives. Lots of operational issues actually collide in really the stakeholder alignment. So let's look at the payers. In terms of the investors and analysts for personalized medicine, we can dramatically reduce healthcare costs. Most payers, in this case, still hesitate to invest. This is always a statement made, okay, we will use personalized medical approaches, we can save costs, but still we see many companies or payers in this case do not adopt the technologies yet and the reimbursement schemes. So it's very hard to identify which tests will ultimately truly save costs and money, although individual tests may actually not be extremely expensive. Sometimes you can get it for a couple of bucks and a few $100s, but still the overall overall eventual costs might be significant and unjustifiable high. So the other aspect I like to mention is that there is still, in many cases, no longitudinal studies on the accounting side. So many tests are recently launched or still in the experimental discovery state in late-stage clinical trials where we see data. So we are still missing like data from tests being in the market for, let's say, 5 or 10 years to really get solid data on the biomarker-based tests, which one will actually eventually save money and which not. So which tests avert the costs? The primary factors to look at are, of course, the per patient savings and the likelihood that a test actually suggests an intervention for a particular individual or patient in this case. Tests that help avoid very expensive therapies are, of course, for the patient very helpful, or such tests that actually prevent adverse reactions before you give a certain drug. You make a quick test if the patient is actually a responder to that, or if it's likely to get an adverse event. And this definitely leads to the cost effectiveness for the payer side. In many cases, these tests can cost $100 to $3,000 each, but ultimately down the line they can still save significantly significant amounts. Just think of the BRCA1 test to predict actually the risk, for example, for a breast cancer patient. The key word here is, of course, companion diagnostics. If you think of the stratifying patients for certain drug treatments. And on the saving sides, the actual cost savings of the personalized medicine tests that we see may not be known, as I mentioned, until the test has been on the market for quite some time. So what we really see is, even though we have better prognostic tests to stratify patients, the payers really delay the adoption. And the generating the high quality health economic evidence in this case would actually, or will actually provide the confidence that enables the payers more rapidly to adopt the tests and will align the physicians' incentives with patient care and outcomes rather than actually procedures. And I'll come back to this point a bit later. So we might end up in a situation where really there will be a competitive advantage for those payers that are implementing policies to promote cost-saving diagnostics. And this is really what we will need to make the system in personalized medicine work. If we look at the providers, today we really have the procedure-based reimbursement system. As you know, in many cases, this is for the providers the most attractive means. Of course, if you tell a cancer surgeon, we can now do a test to stratify your patients, and 50% of your patients down the line or down the route will not need a surgery anymore, he might, from the economic perspective, not be fully aligned with that idea. So the physicians could be more likely to embrace tests that increase the number of procedures performed than actually tests that diminish the procedure volume. On the other hand, we see examples like Oncotype DX, that actually is a test which is stratifying patients for the chemotherapy in breast cancer. And also here, of course, the procedure or the chemotherapy, which is very expensive, is going down through the stratification. But in this case, it has been widely adopted because there is a very clear clinical benefit and merit for the patient. So if we get more of those examples working, the adoption will very likely increase. So in terms of the pharma and biotech companies, companion diagnostics are the keyword, as I mentioned. They really can improve R&D productivity. For example, as I mentioned, the trial size can go smaller. We might get a faster route to market. We enhance the commercial performance of, by boosting actually market share, or we actually support higher drug prices because we now have a very unmet need for such tests, and as I mentioned, from blockbuster to niche buster, and divide the treatable patient population into these sub-segments is, from a commercial perspective, of course, first a risk. But many companies, therefore, still delay investment in this area and are very cautious to launch tests. So we really need, for one, more investments in that area, and the investments that we see are in a very limited space, namely the space where we still have the largest patient cohorts, which is in oncology, immunology, and also infectious diseases. So this is shown here, the scientific potential of companion diagnostics and the economic potential of companion diagnostics. This is the slide, I forgot to mention it, from Frost and Sullivan. So really we see oncology, anti-infectives, and immune drugs in the upper right corner with an early pharmaceutical activity. Just because the pool of potential customers / patients is the largest, which is of course good in that area because we need, particularly for these large cohorts, novel drugs. But on the other hand, if you have other drugs, particularly in the development for rare or neglected diseases, the development for that will be further delayed. So if we now accept that the biomarker discovery combined with a companion diagnostic approach in novel drug discovery is actually the business model forward. There is, of course, a business risk to that. And this table actually just gives a couple of numbers and examples in terms of the sensitivity assumptions, like what's in the worst case, roughly today, and in the best case. The problem that we see in this test development for companion diagnostic is still the time and the investment needed to launch a test for the market. So the time just to develop it in the labs from bed to bench side can be something like 5 years on average, which after you need to get actually payer coverage, which is still a big hurdle in many cases. In the very best scenario, or best case scenario with, let's say, Oncotype DX, it might be only a year. In the worst case, it might be up to 6 years. So an additional 6 years to the discovery. Afterwards, if you have developed a robust test, combine it with clinical data and so on, you have some initial studies to show, you still need to actually get the physicians to adopt it, which can be quite challenging. So you're looking at a long development time, getting similar to actually the drug development cycle, and then at the end of the day, you might only be able to charge something like $2,000 to $3,000 for this test. Yeah, in the interest of time, I'll wrap up quickly now. So business advantages for molecular diagnostics are still models that we see today, like combined to in-house models. Many companies now source out their development, like getting the business to academia and partnering with CROs or academia, universities, institutes. So that is why, for example, our institute in Singapore also collaborates with lots of biotech and pharma companies. And of course, modeling, synthetic biology, and software development play an important role. And eventually, the benefit of there lies that you create a novel market and a niche, which is beneficial for the business side. So just to wrap up, the potential catalysts for the personalized medicine. On the regulatory side, we need an improved approval process, asking questions like, should marker-negative patients be required for actually a late-stage phase 3 trial? How flexible can we get in terms of trial data and design? Will the use of retrospective analysis on archived samples, for example, be permitted and allowed for approving a companion diagnostic, or do we have to do novel studies for that, starting from scratch? Or what regulatory standards are actually required to let the personalized medicine approach and the tests guide clinical decision-making? The diagnostics companies, there might be an opportunity actually to justify higher pricing, but they actually actively must help to shape the guidelines and the standards. And the payer coverage, we definitely need alignment between the different agencies, and we should get to a point where we adequately reimburse companies. Physicians, higher rates for procedure-oriented services than for actually evaluation right now. So we definitely should come to a more outcome-based approach in reimbursement. The pharma and biotech should actually move more towards the value or outcome-based pricing and risk-sharing models, which in many cases they do already through partnering with academia. And this is the end of the presentation, like summarizing that personalized healthcare is actually a key opportunity that I see for improving effective care in healthcare, actually personalized healthcare and drug discovery, and understanding the economics in that field is actually crucial. Asking who pays for what, how much and why, and ultimately the quality will increase, but in terms of the quality of the diagnostic testing, that really needs to be exceptional. Like the genomics-based biomarkers should really be synced with phenotypic data and clinical data. We need more flexible reimbursement systems to demonstrate actually the evidence of value, and then ultimately all stakeholders actually must work together to reshape the incentives, and that way I think personalized medicine will actually come to the best benefit. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this interesting overview, how we can have a future which is economical, maybe more sustainable. Who would like to start the discussion with a question? Yeah, please.
Yeah.
I mean, this was a very nice talk.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. What I see also is that this is a very oncology-centric view.
Yeah.
And it maybe reflect the actual situations that we have. And maybe this is one of the things that we have to change if we want to have a success. And I was thinking now in what happened with the antibodies. So the biologics, they were used, and they were used for many years also for oncology application, but it was when the TNF, the anti-TNF antibodies started to be in the market, and for other diseases, that was a boom. And the same situation is what I see here, that maybe if we will start to use in other diseases that can have, because we go into almost terminal situations, and this is the risk. The people are very much afraid because they don't see a benefit. We are treating patients that they are really going to die. And I think that we have to have the courage to start to extend to other diseases and start to see the benefits. It's just to start talking.
No, that's a very good point. I mean, particularly in the field of personalized medicine and biomarker-based discovery, which is extremely expensive, people say, why do we frankly invest so much money and then get marginal gains like 2, 3, 4 months? Not saying these patients happily live healthy and happy for these 3, 4 months. We just extend the lifespan. So what we really need is novel approaches and target novel diseases and then really make good cases and examples that it's actually worth to invest in these discovery projects, which still all the sides and the stakeholders hesitate a lot to do.
I think this is one of the most crucial questions of the whole healthcare system, that we cannot afford everything, but we do not want to think about quantifying the value of life. And that this is a taboo which we all respect, but we come to a point where we don't know how to proceed, maybe. It was interesting to hear you. However, I think you left out a little bit. You spoke about the increase of the general cost for a drug. If you don't have the big market, it's positive for all the patients which were useless treated. However, I think who pays then for the development for this cost for a small group? And I'm afraid that the more personalized it is, it might also be that some groups will be left out, as nobody will develop, as they cannot afford, the companies cannot afford to do it with increasing costs and the included diagnostics, which both together will not be reimbursed.
True. I mean, that is actually the reason why in many cases the regulatory authorities say, okay, we have specific schemes and timeframes for orphan drugs. So to make it more attractive to go actually in these niche markets, which are even slower than a normal stratified patient cohort, and say, okay, even we have only like a few thousand patients, you get a fast track, you get a longer patent life, you can ask for higher prices. Coverage will be handled by the companies / government, so that to make it to actually incentivize the companies in that way. Yeah.
Yes, you have orphan drugs for orphan indications, but if you have a major indication but a small patient group, maybe you do not have the orphan designation.
True.
And then you have the problem.
Yep.
But this is a problem which has to be solved. Yeah?
I would like to be more optimistic. I think that there is a hope that they can be, if not maybe personalized, this more precise medicine, as very often we also say, because if you have to develop a pill or a treatment for every single individual, then it's a problem. But you can have treatment that they are really very specific. And, there will be a big change in 1 or 2 years also when all the biosimilars come to the market. Hopefully the people will be out of corticosteroids because they will have another situation. So the only way for the companies also to continue surviving is to develop drugs that they are better. And better is probably to try to aim for the cure.
Well, if it sounded too negative, the positive thing of this is certainly that we have less side effects and more tailor-made drugs. So this side for the patient is absolutely and undisputable positive. However, whether we can save money or whether we even increase the cost and who pays for it, this remains another discussion which has to be solved. I would like now to hand over to